Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective, breaking down the are all white people racist straw man argument. Now, before we get into it, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you ever thought a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I want to dissect this conversation that Jordan Peterson had with African Brooks on the bottom and on his daughter's podcast. She's at the top, Michaela Peterson. And they're talking about, are all white people racist? Now, this is a straw man argument. They will not present facts. In fact, they will even distort certain realities. And I want to break this down because this is a common theme today where white people are attempting to turn the tables. In other words, if we talk about the problem, or what they consider the problem, which is just talking about the problem of race, as Jordan Peterson often argues against what he calls identity politics, group politics, instead of the individuals. And these arguments tend to steer away from the realities of racism, the effects of racism. So I want to play this video, and then I'm at the end. I'm going to play a brilliant response to Jordan Peterson's attitudes. But let's dissect this statement here.
Would be interesting, this idea about all white people being racist. So I kind of wondered about that as a psychologist, but more broadly, because maybe you could say, well, are all people racist? And
okay, so right away, this is again. Let me say this. I'm cutting into a conversation. He's shifted. This is an hour podcast, and he's shifted the thought to this. So he's purposely talking about this question: are all white people racist? And then notice he said, as a psychologist, he's a Canadian psychologist with a PhD. Which makes to me the situation even worse because he is a man of thought. He's a man who has access to information, but yet choose to hold, and I'm terming this his white conservative point of view. And then he says, are all people racist? Now right here, we have to understand where he's corralling the thoughts. First, the word racism needs to be defined. As it is used today, it is more generic. What he is going to describe is people's prejudice, biases, inclinations. But when we refer to the word racist or racism, that word needs to be defined as it was developed. It is a recent word in human history, directly tied to the Atlantic slave trade. And hence the term race in the racism was when you had a group of people, meaning Europeans, Caucasians, who targeted a specific race of people and enslaved them. Further, the term racism then is the systematic but also power. It involves the power of one race to oppress another race, more specifically Europeans who had the power, white people who had the power, and then they enslaved, they targeted a specific race of people. Now it should be noted that the term race, from an anthropologist perspective, doesn't exist. But from a social, it exists, and we use it, we relate to it. Which means that's why racism became important to the Atlantic slave trade. Now he's going to use some phrases and terms that he shouldn't be used in connection with racism. For sure, biases, prejudices, but not racism. So let's continue.
Here's what I mean by that. Well, we all have an in-group preference. Now, what that group might be, it might be you and the person you love, it might be you and your family, it might be you and your town, it might be you and your state or your country, it might be you and your race. Who that in-group is can vary, but we do have preferences for people, and we do have in-group preferences, and the corollary of that is that we have out-group skepticism and maybe fear and maybe disgust and all of that.
But see, this is not race. And if you notice, what he's not mentioning is the power and the ability to oppress. Notice he's not saying that, and that's on purpose. Prejudice, as he is using, or he's the idea of saying that you have group preference, that's prejudice or bias. And I'm not going to even say that in that context that is all bad. In other words, if you say, I love Greek people, and you take all your vacations to the Greek islands, that's okay. So that could be an example of that. That's not what he means, but it could be an example of that. Now, of course, in the negative context, you can say, well, I don't like Greek people. I don't like Irish people. I don't like African people. I don't like Hispanic people. Those are prejudice. Those are biases. The difference in race and racism is when you afflict them, you conquer them, you afflict them, you oppress them for your own purpose. You target a specific race, and in this case, the word racism is unique to the Atlantic slave trade, and that made the Atlantic slave trade different than all the other forms of slavery that had existed since the beginning of man. Now that's important because you hear these arguments all the time, where people say there's always been slavery. True, but you never had slavery like the Atlantic slave trade, where they targeted a specific group or race of people. And that's what he is not saying here. Thus, he's corralling. He's building up the straw man argument so he can destroy it. Because then he'll say, well, that's silly. Well, of course it's silly, but what he's not talking about is the horrors and evil of what the Atlantic slave trade did by even developing the very phrase racism. Let's continue.
From what I've been able to understand anthropologically, that's more or less a human universal. As different peoples have been brought around the world into global community, let's say, one of the things that anthropologists have found is that it's almost always the case that any given tribe of people will use the word that refers to human beings to their tribe and some other word to everyone else. And so it's possible that that's a deep tendency that we all have to fight against.
Now, I want you to notice he uses the term, it's possible. Now, whenever you see phrases like that in arguments, it is a way of making the statement without making the statement. In other words, if you say, well, you said this, well, I said it's possible. Now, you listen to those kind of phrases, and then you see how he's, again, characterizing his argument here. Let's continue.
I mean, there's part of the reason these ideas are so compelling to people and able to possess them, the wokeness ideas, let's say, to use a casual category, is that, you know, they contain an element of truth. You know, people have an in-group preference that can easily be distorted into something that's quite akin to racism. I mean, you even see that in chimpanzees.
Now, notice he uses the term racism without defining it. It's important that he defines it because, and he's getting ready to bring up issues like he's gonna compare his kind of argument to monkeys. Now, let me just say the difference in uh, how monkeys act. He's going to describe this. They're not their reaction, and basically here's the thing. He's talking about group versus individualities, and then he's saying that, well, monkeys act in a certain way that they attack anybody that's not a part of their group. Okay, that's different than racism if the same group of monkeys beat up any monkeys that's outside of their group, and that's what he's referring to, any monkeys outside of their group, if they beat them up, put them in chains, and enslave them. That's racism. Now, what he's also talking about is just plain human behavior, sinful human behavior, that we act like monkeys or we beat up on each other. But not everybody does that. Let's continue.
For example, they'll go on raiding forays into neighboring territories, and if they outnumber, the males do this, if they outnumber the foreigners that they come across, they will tear them to pieces. So it's, that was a stunning discovery. Lovely that primatologists made. Jane Goodall's team discovered that in the 70s. It was a real shock.
Wow.
Right. So
they were trying to find all the nice chimps.
Yeah, well, they're
like, oh, they just rip each other to shreds. Whoa, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no one had any inkling previous to that human tendency for war, broadly speaking, was so deep that it was even shared by our closest animal relative. So this is very deep. So, the idea that racism and in-group preference, all of that, is something that human beings struggle with is true. And then you say, well, you twist that a bit. You say, well, that's particularly true of white people because they hold the power.
Okay. So notice he said racism, but now watch this. It is particularly true of white people. The racism, yes, because they were racist. But he's not through here. I probably should let this play on, but listen to this next statements.
Well, it's an interesting proposition, but the question is, well, if it's true, exactly how is it true, and what's its limits, and how does that play out in the case of other races or groups, Asians, for example?
Right.
All right, so let me chime in on this because he says, if it's true, how does it play out? Well, we have an entire history of colonialism. We have an entire history of American slavery where they captured Africans, chained Africans, enslaved Africans for 346 years, including Jim Crow. That's the example there. That's the example what he's talking about. And this is the example that he's not going to talk about. Or at the very least, as a clinical psychologist, tell me how the African slave trade and Jim Crow segregation is not racist or is not dangerous, was not, whatever it is he's trying to defend. Tell me how it's not that. See? He's leaving out an entire experience and history in this straw man argument here. Let's continue.
And what are the dangers of putting the idea that way? And what makes you so sure that that's also not true of your group? And how
Mm-hmm.
does power play into that? Like, these are all genuine questions that we should be asking
Right.
ourselves, instead of like hammering home the idea that we have the answer to this. It's like,
Okay, so how do we know that this is true? We have history. The America fought the bloodiest war. Believe that the bloodiest war in American history was over slavery, ending slavery. It didn't end racism, it ended slavery. Let me also say this, that Jordan Peterson and then everyone on what you see in the picture, Africa Brooks, his daughter, they live. Africa Brooks, I believe, lives in is from London. I could be wrong. I believe she's from London, but certainly and then Jordan Peterson's from Canada. Now here's my thing: they had slavery, right? The British Empire had slavery. Slaves fled to Canada. There's racist acts. There are racist how people view Africans, people of color. So what is his argument when he says, how do we know it's true? Well, we have history. We have everyday experiences in the news, even in Canada. Let's continue.
well, you said, you got elevated as a black woman in this. Well, it's very difficult to not see that as an exacerbation of your in-group preference, and then an exaggeration of that implicit or explicit racism on your part. And I think that's part of what you were rebelling against.
Yes, 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 yes. And you know what? The questions that you were just asking before, those are the exact questions that I had. Just simple questions. And it started to signal again that something wasn't right here, that I couldn't even just ask the simplest questions, or at least felt that I couldn't. I could have, but I was much more scared of the consequences of asking the questions than leading with the curiosity of getting some kind of answer, right?
Now, since I'm not really dealing with her point of view here, I don't know where she's coming from. What questions couldn't she ask? Who was she afraid to ask them? What was the response that she was afraid of? If I was to take the context, I'm thinking it is blowback for asking, is racism, the arguments of racism legitimate? That's the context I would assume, but she's not clear, so I can't definitely say that. But let's continue.
And in my letter, Michaela, you read this part out earlier about the disempowerment of Black people. That's how I started to feel extremely disempowered. Even when people would say things like, yeah, it's because white people have all the power. According to who? And in what context are we talking about? Does it matter where in the world you are?
All right, now you notice she asked this question, and then Jordan makes the statement. Now, first she says, I feel disempowered because white people have the power. And then she says, according to who? Well, according to reality, right? So, her as a black woman, and how far can she get in certain areas? And then he says, and then according to what white people? So this is disingenuous. Now, to be fair here, context is everything. How do we examine race today, for example, in Africa, in her experience? I can even say the same thing about my experience. Let me give you an example. Like, if in 1920, Madam C.J. Walker was the first black woman millionaire. Yet, now get this, Now, so as long as she stayed on the colored side of town, she enjoyed her life. She enjoyed her millions. She made money. Okay, she was a millionaire. Okay. Madam C.J. Walker could not eat at a white restaurant in his house. So what I'm saying is, what Africa is saying is that, while on the one hand, Madam C.J. Walker for the 1920s was pioneer, right? The first millionaire, black millionaire, woman at least. But at the same time, she was confined to the other side of the tracks. She couldn't eat in a restaurant because of the color of her skin. So she said, according to who? According to reality, Africa. And then he says, well, what white people? The white people that would have arrested and beat Madam C.J. Walker had she entered into that restaurant. Okay, so let's come back to the present times when she says, well, white people have the power. Well, so the question is it true? Do white people still have the power? The answer is yes. Has things changed? Absolutely. But to deny that they don't have it, you have people who are actively, working against the black empowerment. Now, black people, I'm sorry, but then you have this, I notice you have this, we're growing. But here's the interesting thing, not based upon Jordan Peterson's circle. Let's continue.
Which ones? Right?
I had an experience like that. It not exactly like that. It was like that, but for me. And I was taking sciences because I'd switched out of humanities because there was a lot of, I was taking a course on Homer and it was Homer through the feminist lens. And I was like, that's not what I paid you guys for. So I switched into sciences, and about every couple of months somebody would come in and they'd say, okay, for all the women in the room, I know you've had a much harder time getting to where you are than the men have. And I was just like, are you telling me I'm stupid? Like, what exactly are you saying here? And how dare you suggest that it was like insulting in kind of a condescending way, which was the complete opposite of whatever they were. Well, maybe it wasn't the opposite of what they were trying to do. But yeah, it's condescending and irritating.
Yeah, well,
bugged me.
Well, think about what that does in some sense. It makes your generic femininity and your generic vulnerability far more important than your individual particularity. Yeah. And this is what I've been objecting to with regards to this group mentality from the beginning. It seems to me that its fundamental danger, the fundamental danger is the devaluation of the sacredness of the individual as the primary category. You replace that by group identity, you have no idea what kind of devil you're messing with. Or maybe you do to some degree. You experienced it a bit because you.
Okay, I'm gonna end it there because I want to get to another video, because I'm gonna let Dr. Eric Dyson answer that exact ideology. Now keep this in mind. This video is maybe a year or two after this exchange I'm getting ready to play. But here's the thing. I think it's the absurdity of saying that you have group, the group. Now what he's saying that is that, remember the phrase, are all white people racist? And I would ask, who's saying that? Who is saying all white people are racist? Now without a doubt there are some black people who said, but do those black people represent the general consensus of the black movement, or any movement, or any kind of group? No more than a white person saying something represents the entire group. And then when he says individuality, well, remember, individualities make up groups. See, individualities signed the Constitution that left black people enslaved. Individuals made up Jim Crow laws. So, but I'm going to let Dr. Eric Dyson. This is another, again, exchange that happened a couple of years before between Jordan Peterson and Dr. Eric Dyson. He's a professor, and he's going to say something that's going to really, really irritate Jordan Peterson. He's going to, but what he's going to say is something that's, I think, the argument itself is brilliant. So let's listen.
Mike, I want to come to you on those, great Michelle, on Jordan's point about how does he, in a sense, get an equal voice in this debate back if it is implied that his participation brings with it this baggage of white privilege that doesn't allow him to see clearly the issues that are before us.
Now, let me just say this before we get into the exchange. It is worth watching the entire debate here, and we're cutting in on just this snippet, admitting, yes. So what led up to Dr. Dyson's response is some of the same things we saw in the previous video about identity. Are all white people racist? But up until this previously, Jordan had, in a snarky way, said, well, tell me about my white privilege. How much of a white privilege am I due? How can I have, how much of white privilege do I have to tell? And he's answering this, and you're going to see Dr. Dyson's, in my opinion, smackdown. Let's continue.
To be complicit in the very problem itself terminologically. You're beginning at a point that's already productive and controversial. You're saying, how can he get his equality back? Who are you talking about? Jordan Peterson, trending #1 on Twitter? Jordan Peterson, with an international bestseller? I want him to tweet something out about me in my book. Jordan Peterson, right? This is what I'm saying to you. Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man, and you're gonna get us right. And
okay, you can see that statement, mean, mad white man, really got to Jordan. But I want you, let Dr. Dyson finish, because beyond the mean, mad white man, he nails Jordan Peterson. Listen up.
I have never seen so much wine and snowflaking. There's enough wine in here to start a vineyard. And what I'm saying to you empirically and precisely, when you ask the question about white privilege, the fact that you ask it in the way you did, dismissive, pseudoscientific, non-empirical, and without justification, the truth is that white privilege doesn't act according to quantifiable segments. It's about the degree to which we are willing as a society to grapple with the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality upon which it's based. Number two, what's interesting to me, you're talking about not having a collective identity. What do you call a nation? Are you Canadian? Are you Canadian by yourself? Are you an individual, or are you part of a group? When America formed its union, it did so in opposition to another group. So the reality is that those who are part of group identities in politics deny the legitimacy and validity of those groups and the fact that they have been created thusly, and then have resentment against others. All I'm asking for is the opportunity. The quotation you talk about, the difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity, that's a staid and retried argument, hackneyed phrase derived from the halcyon days of the debate over affirmative action. Are you looking for outcomes that can be determined equally, or are you looking for opportunity? If you free a person after a whole long time of oppression and say, now now you are free to survive. If you have no skills, if you have no quantifiable means of existence, what you have done is liberated them into oppression. And all I'm suggesting to you, Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of our great presidents, said, if you start a man in a race 100 years behind, it is awfully difficult to catch up. So I don't think Jordan Peterson is suffering from anything except an exaggerated sense of entitlement and resentment, and his own privilege is invisible to him, and it's manifest with lethal intensity and ferocity right here on stage.
Jordan, I'm going to have to let you.
All right. I thought that was a mic drop moment. Of course, obviously, if you are a Jordan Peterson / conservative / Republican, you're going to say differently. The point I think that was brilliantly brought out by Dr. Dyson was this. And none of that does just Jordan Peterson ever address. He dismisses it. See, and then talking about are all white people racist without talking about racist. When you have a history, when you have every day in the news example, even in Canada, even in London, there are race problems all over. And then you ask them, well, why are there race problems? And some of the things that Jordan Peterson said is true, that you start off with individual hate and bigotry that then what? Evolves into group racism that passes laws that, as in the European colonial movement, targeted Africans, oppressed Africans. Much more can be said about this. Look, that is my perspective, and love to hear your opinions and your views. Add to the comment section. Remember, all comments are welcome. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. Till next time, I'll see you then.